Hello, everyone. My name is Lillian Blake, and today I'll be presenting on phonetic patterns in Ukrainian-speaking English language learners, specifically comparing students raised in the United States versus those raised in Ukraine. So I will walk you through the topic and motivation behind this project. I will then share the background on the participants, provide transcriptions and analysis of their speech, and finally offer suggestions and conclusions for instruction. All right, so first I'm going to go over my topic and my motivation with you. My topic is phonetic analysis and instructional interventions for Ukrainian-speaking English language learners raised in the United States versus Ukraine. So my main question here is, what are the key pronunciation differences and common errors between Ukrainian students who learned English in Ukraine versus those who learned it in the United States but only spoke Ukrainian at home with their parents and family. And so I want to see if there's any differences in the errors they make or in their pronunciations of words or any speaking habits they have based on the context they were raised in. I have three main reasons for why I wanted to study this topic. One, it matters because of the number of Ukrainian speakers entering in the ESL classroom, in ENL classroom. There's been such an increase due to global events recently, and so it's something I care about a lot. Secondly, there's such an influx of Ukrainian speakers in my own personal community. I'm surrounded by Ukrainian speakers a lot, and so I'm just very curious about how learning context shapes pronunciation, which is basically my last motivation for this project. Now I'm going to go over who I interviewed and what their background is. The first participant is a male. He moved from Kiev, Ukraine when he was 16 years old. He grew up receiving some English instruction in the classroom, but it was taught by Ukrainian teachers only. So there were no native English speakers in the classroom. He's now 24 years old, and he speaks clearly, but still has a very strong accent. The second participant that I interviewed is a 17-year-old male who grew up in the United States in Cleveland, Tennessee, but his parents and his family only speaks to him in Ukrainian. So he goes to a Ukrainian church, and his friends are Ukrainian, most of them, except for at school he speaks English, but everywhere else he speaks Ukrainian. And so Ukrainian is his first language, although he grew up in the United States. It is his first language, and he has a strong accent as well. All right, so now I'm going to go over my speech samples with you. I had a hard time getting these onto the computer, and so I'm going to play them on my phone. This is going to be participant number 1, who is 24 years old and moved from Ukraine when he was 16.
Which was the North wind and the sun were disputing which was stronger when traveler came wrapped in a warm cloak. They agreed that the one who first succeeded in making the traveler take his cloak off should be considered stronger than the other. Then the north wind blew as hard as he could, but the more he blew, the more closely did the traveler fold his cloak around him, and at last the north wind gave up the attempt. Then the sun shined out warmly, and immediately the traveler took his cloak off, and so the north wind was obliged to confess that the sun was the stronger of the two.
All right, that was the first speech sample. I hope you were able to hear it well enough. You can tell that he still has a very strong accent, but most of what he says is understandable. All right, my second speech sample I'm going to play for you. This is the 17-year-old male who grew up in the United States, but only was surrounded by people who spoke Ukrainian.
Fable, the North Wind and the Sun. great when comparing dialects of World English. The north wind and the sun were disrupting which was the stronger. When a traveler came along wrapped in a warm cloak, they agreed that the one who first succeeded in making the traveler take his cloak off should be considered stronger than the other. Then the north wind blew as hard as he could, but the more he blew, the more closely the traveler folded his cloak around him. And at last, the north wind gave up at the attempt. Then the sun shined out warmly, and immediately the traveler took off his cloak. And so the north wind was obliged to confess that the sun was stronger of the two.
All right. So that was the second speech sample. And now I'm going to go into my analysis and my transcription of these speech samples. So here I have completely transcribed both speech samples, which took quite some time, but I highlighted some key differences in their speech versus standard English. So you can see here, I have both of the transcriptions. And now I want to break down a few of them since that's a lot. I'm going to go into my analysis of these transcriptions. All right, so I'm going to start with my analysis of speaker number 1, who is from Ukraine and learned English in Ukraine, but only from native Ukrainian English speakers. His English has improved a lot since moving to the United States and being fully immersed, but there is still a lot of that language one influence which comes out in his speech. And so I have a few examples of that here. The first one being the voiceless fricative TH sound. This sound does not exist in Ukrainian, and so it is often replaced with a more familiar fricative such as S or Z. So if you have the word think, it might become zinc or sink. The word three might become zri or sri. Thanks might become zanks. On top of that, there is the voiced TH sound, which also does not exist in Ukrainian. So these two TH sounds do not exist at all, and this one is substituted more with the D sound. So this may sound like this, that may sound like dat, brother may sound like brother. There's also a struggle with the W sound, the W sound. Ukrainian lacks the appropriate W, so learners substitute it with V instead. So words like wine might become vine, or as you heard in the story, wind became wind. There is also a vowel shift, and so the I sound might become E beat, so bit might become beat. At turns into an sound, so cat may become cot, and turns into an aw sound, so cut may become caught. Lastly, last two things, Ukrainian is a syllable time language while English is a stress time language, and so the speaker tends to give equal stress to each word instead of putting stress on specific words, so it sounds a little bit unnatural. And also there's more of a rolling of an R, which we do not have in English. But in Russian, they do roll their R's or they tap them, and so that comes out in his speech as well. Now I'm going to show you examples from the next speaker who was raised in the United States, but he was only surrounded by Ukrainian speakers, and Ukrainian was his first language. And so he has similar pronunciation issues for the most part. His speech is a lot easier to understand than the first participant, but he still has a lot of similar struggles. So the voiced TH sound becomes a D instead of a th, which is similar to the speaker before. Final consonant reduction into voicing. So there's not as much emphasis put on the final letters, which can make it kind of hard to understand what they're saying. So for example, the word bad may become bat, And so it kind of sounds like a T sound because there's not enough emphasis on that letter D, duh sound. So the speaker just doesn't put enough stress on that last letter, so it sounds like another letter. And then finally, simplification of function words. This speaker does a little bit better at using the English stress-timed language pattern instead of using a syllable time language pattern. And so he does simplify the words needed and um, puts pronunciation and stress in more of the correct places, but it's still not fully there to where it's natural. So now I'm going to compare the two speakers to each other instead of comparing their speech to standard English. I'm going to start by highlighting the consonant differences between the two transcriptions. So to start off, speaker number 1, who was raised in Ukraine, consistently replaced the voiced dental fricative the with z. So the th, voiced th sound, as I mentioned before, does not exist in Ukrainian, so it's often replaced with a z sound. So speaker number 1 always replaced the th with a z, but speaker number 2 started to replace it with a schwa or with a d sound, which was more in line with standard English. And so it wasn't perfect pronunciation, but it was more correct to standard English. Secondly, the W and the V sound. The W sound does not exist in Russian and Ukrainian either, and so it is often replaced with the V. So speaker number 1 would mispronounce words like wind for wind, or warm for warm, or wind for wind. While speaker number 2 would do a better job at implementing that W sound, that W sound, into their reading. Now we're going to look at vowel differences between the two speakers. When comparing the vowel usage, we see that speaker number 1, who learned English in Ukraine, tends to substitute the central vowel with a lower and backer vowel like all. For example, instead of saying was, he would say was, or the word stronger would become stronger. The vowel shift makes his speech sound more foreign to English listeners, while speaker number 2 would use the more standard English pronunciation with the schwa to align more with the correct English pronunciation. And also there was differences in the pronunciation of R-colored vowels. Speaker number 1 avoids or mispronounces these sounds, producing words like traveler, traveler instead of traveler, where the final ER syllable lacks the expected R coloring. This results in a flatter, more monotone sound. Meanwhile, speaker number 2 demonstrates more appropriate rhotic R endings. Okay, lastly, I'm going to compare their stress and rhythm. This was something that really intrigued me because I was surprised by what I noticed. I think I would need to have more participants and more speech samples to examine to have a definite answer for this, but I noticed that speaker number 1 had more natural stress timed English patterns, but there was still a focus on a syllable time cadence, while speaker number 2 had more isolated word pronunciation, but had the correct stress on words. So speaker number 1 was more fluid in their speech and read more clearly, but still kind of had an emphasis on that syllable time language, while speaker number 2, their reading was a little bit more choppy, but they put the right intonation on different words, which reflected a more fluent English pattern. All right, finally, I'm going to move to suggestions and conclusions. So I came up with some teaching strategies for speaker number 1 and speaker number 2. So speaker number 1 struggles a lot more with pronunciation, and so I thought that minimal pairs would be a good idea, or visual articulation drills where the teacher shows tongue positions for the sound and the sound and the rounding for who. So just showing how those sounds are pronounced with your mouth would be important. In oral pairs, letting the student recognize the difference in the two sounds, like then and zen and when and when. Rhythm and reduction practice. So the student would shadow native speakers and clap out the stress. So the dogs are outside. The dogs are sitting outside, and practice putting the stress on those correct words instead of putting stress on every single syllable. Vowel charts and listening discrimination for central and back vowels, since speaker number 1 struggles with back vowels. Using the color chart, color vowels would help, and showing them the difference between E and ah and how to pronounce all those different sounds. And lastly, recording and playback, letting the student monitor their own speech and pick out the things that they notice that they struggle with. Speaker number 2 had more correct pronunciation, so still some of those drills would be very helpful for speaker number 2, but they aren't as necessary. Speaker number 2 more needs help with fluency because they have a harder time getting all of their words out. So fluency and connected speech drills using stories, dialogues, and natural conversation recordings. This could also be high-level tongue twisters. So just having them speak a lot over and over and over again to get that fluency out. And advanced listening activities, similar to speaker number 1, focus on the native speaker rhythm and stress. So since they are always around Ukrainian speakers, having them listen to native English speakers and what their stress patterns are like could be very helpful. All right, that is my slideshow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.